The arrival and the cold encounter. The boutique that shined like glass. It was the kind of day where the sunlight danced off every building, the city humming in its usual rhythm. In one of the wealthiest parts of downtown stood La Belle Maison, a boutique whose name alone echoed exclusivity. Its towering glass windows shone under the afternoon sun, showcasing designer bags, shimmering jewelry, and shoes that cost more than most monthly rents. Jason Cole, a man with quiet confidence and dignified strides, walked alongside his 12-year-old daughter, Ava. She held tightly onto her small purse, the colorful keychains jingling faintly as they entered the pristine boutique. Jason was a man who had built everything he had with his own two hands. From humble beginnings, he had turned a modest startup into a fashion empire, though he preferred to stay out of the spotlight. Today wasn't about business, though. It was about Ava. "Are you sure this is the place, Dad?" Ava whispered. Her voice carried that mix of awe and nervousness that only kids her age could pull off. "Everything in here looks so expensive." Jason smiled softly, his deep brown eyes crinkling. "That's because it is, sweetheart. But we're here because I want you to pick something for your art showcase next month. You've earned it." Ava beamed, her nerves easing slightly. She was talented beyond her years. Her art teacher often said she painted emotions, not pictures. The boutique's interior was like walking into a glass dream. Marble floors so polished they reflected your every step, displays so perfectly arranged they felt untouchable. As Jason and Ava browsed, they caught the attention of Elaine Reed, the boutique manager. Elaine's sharp gaze. Elaine had worked at La Belle Maison for nearly a decade, and in her mind, she was the store. She was the gatekeeper, the judge of who belonged. Her sharp features and ice-blonde hair were as meticulously arranged as the boutique itself. Elaine believed she could spot who was a serious shopper and who was a waste of time. Today, her gaze fell on Jason and Ava. Elaine's lips curled slightly, her manicured fingers tapping on the counter. "They don't belong here," she thought. Another waste of time. The first blow. "Dad, look at this one," Ava said, pointing to a pastel purse that stood out from the sea of monochrome designer bags. Before Jason could respond, Elaine's heels clicked sharply on the marble floor as she approached. Her voice was clipped and cool, slicing through the boutique's calm. "Can I help you with something?" Jason turned, his face polite but unreadable. "We're just browsing, thank you." Elaine's eyes flicked to Ava's small purse and Jason's simple, well-worn jacket. Her disdain was subtle but sharp. "Browsing? I see," she replied, her smile thin. "Well, if you have any questions about the prices, let me know." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Ava's small shoulders tensed, and Jason's jaw tightened ever so slightly. "We'll let you know," Jason replied evenly, holding his calm. Elaine lingered for a moment before turning, but her muttered comment wasn't quiet enough. "Some people just don't know their place." The words struck like a slap. Jason's calm demeanor remained, but Ava's face fell. She tugged at her father's sleeve. "Let's go, Dad," she whispered. "We don't need to be here." Jason crouched down beside her, his voice soft but steady. "Don't ever let someone else decide where you belong, Ava. You hear me?" She nodded, but the hurt still lingered in her wide eyes. The second encounter. Jason stood and guided Ava toward another section, determined to salvage the outing. They passed rows of glittering watches, Jason occasionally pointing out items to distract her, to bring back her smile. But Elaine watched their every move. Her irritation grew, as if Jason and Ava's presence offended the very air she breathed. When Jason picked up a pair of elegant shoes to show Ava, Elaine decided she'd had enough. She marched over, her heels striking the floor like hammers. "Excuse me," she said sharply. "I must insist that you refrain from handling the merchandise unless you intend to make a purchase." Jason turned slowly, his calm beginning to fray. "I wasn't aware that browsing was against store policy." Elaine's smile was icy. "It's not. But some of our items are quite valuable, and we have to be careful." The word hung heavy with implication. Ava looked up at her father, her eyes pleading silently. "Let's just leave." Jason sighed, placing the shoes gently back on the shelf. "You're right, Ava. Let's go." As they turned to leave, Elaine's voice chased after them, one final jab slipping past her lips. "Yes, perhaps that's for the best. This store isn't exactly your style." The walk of silence. Outside, the city's noise felt deafening after the sterile quiet of the boutique. Ava clung to Jason's hand, her small fingers gripping tightly. "Why did she treat us like that?" Ava asked softly, her voice a mix of confusion and sadness. "We didn't do anything wrong." Jason crouched beside her again, brushing a stray braid from her face. "Sometimes people judge others before they know anything about them. That doesn't make them right." "But it still hurts," Ava admitted, blinking quickly to stop her tears. Jason felt his chest tighten. He wanted to shield her from moments like this, but the world had a way of revealing its harshness. "You matter, Ava," Jason said firmly. "Don't ever let someone make you feel like you don't. People like that don't define us. We define ourselves." Ava nodded, her small face still uncertain. "Can we just go home now?" Jason's expression shifted, his gaze turning back toward the boutique's glass doors. "In a minute," he replied softly. "There's something I need to take care of first." Ava looked up at him, confused. "What do you mean?" Jason stood, his face calm but resolute. "Just wait here for a moment, sweetheart." And with that, he turned back toward the boutique. A father's restraint. The walk to clarity. The sidewalk buzzed with life as Jason and Ava left the boutique. Car horns echoed from the nearby intersection, and passers-by rushed along, their lives unaffected by the quiet storm that had unfolded moments before. To the rest of the world, it was just another afternoon. To Jason and Ava, it was something far heavier. Ava's small footsteps faltered as she struggled to keep up with her father's longer strides. Jason realized and slowed down, looking down at her. Her face was a careful mask of bravery, but her tightly clenched fists and lowered gaze betrayed her hurt. "Let's take a seat," Jason said softly, nodding toward a small bench under a nearby tree. Ava sat without a word, the jingling keychains on her purse unusually still. Jason joined her, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. For a long moment, neither spoke. Ava's little legs dangled over the edge of the bench as her toes traced invisible shapes on the pavement. "Why did she do that to us, Dad?" she finally asked, breaking the silence. Jason inhaled slowly, choosing his words with care. "Because sometimes people see only what they want to see. Not who we really are, but who they think we are." Ava looked up, her eyes shimmering. "But we didn't do anything wrong." "I know," Jason replied, his voice steady but filled with quiet frustration. "And people like her, people who judge before they understand, won't see that. But you know what matters more." Ava shook her head. "How you see yourself," Jason said, pointing gently to her heart. "We don't need their approval, Ava. Never forget who you are or what you're worth, no matter what someone else says." Ava hesitated. "I still feel small, though, like I wasn't supposed to be there." Jason's jaw tightened, a wave of anger rolling through him before he pushed it down. He couldn't let it show. Not now, not in front of Ava. He reached for her hand, his touch warm and steady. "You belong wherever you choose to be," he said firmly. "The world will try to make you doubt that, but you hold your ground. Always." Ava nodded, though the weight of the encounter lingered in her small shoulders. She leaned against Jason's side, her head resting against his arm. Jason wrapped an arm around her, his gaze fixed back on the boutique's shining glass doors across the street. The turning point. Jason's mind churned like a quiet storm. He replayed the encounter over and over, Elaine's dismissive tone, the way she had looked at Ava like she was less than, the cold satisfaction in her smirk as they left. For a man who had spent his life building a name for himself, for his family, there was no greater pain than seeing his daughter's confidence shaken, and he couldn't let it stand. "Sweetheart," Jason said after a pause, "how about you head into that cafe right there and get yourself a hot chocolate? I'll join you in a minute." Ava sat up, looking at him with a mix of confusion and worry. "Where are you going?" "Just back across the street to handle something," Jason replied with a small smile. "It won't take long." Ava frowned. "Are you going to yell at her?" Jason chuckled softly. "No, sweetheart. I don't need to raise my voice to make a point." Ava studied his face for a moment, her young eyes trying to read the quiet resolve in his expression. Finally, she nodded. "Okay, but don't let her make you feel small either." Jason's smile widened, warmth filling his chest. "I won't, Ava. I promise." She slipped off the bench and skipped toward the cafe, her braids bouncing with every step. Jason watched her until she disappeared through the door, then turned back toward the boutique. His face shifted, his expression now calm, unreadable, yet carrying a quiet power that would be impossible to ignore. The return. Inside the boutique, Elaine Reed stood behind the counter, inspecting a new shipment of handbags. She hummed quietly to herself, proud of how she had handled what she saw as a disruption earlier. Her satisfaction was short-lived. The glass doors opened with a faint chime, and Jason Cole stepped inside. His strides were slow, deliberate, as if he were walking through a space that he already owned. Elaine looked up, irritation flashing across her face before she masked it with a tight, insincere smile. "You're back," she said, her tone holding a hint of disdain. "I thought we'd already established this wasn't the store for you." Jason didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked around the boutique, his gaze sweeping across the pristine shelves, the perfectly arranged displays, the soft lighting, all of it a reflection of years of effort. Years he had spent building this empire. Elaine's impatience grew with each passing second. "Sir, if you don't plan to make a purchase, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Jason's gaze snapped back to her, sharp and unwavering. "You're Elaine Reed, correct?" Elaine blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "Yes, I manage this store," she replied, her voice faltering slightly. "Why?" Jason reached into the inside pocket of his tailored jacket and pulled out a sleek black card. He placed it gently on the counter in front of her. Elaine's eyes narrowed as she picked up the card, glancing at it. Her smug expression faltered instantly. The boutique's name was embossed in elegant gold lettering, along with a single title: Jason Cole, founder and owner. Her breath caught in her throat as the color drained from her face. The silence that followed was deafening. Jason's voice broke the stillness, calm and steady as ever. "You work for me, Elaine." The words hit like a thunderclap. Elaine stared at him, wide-eyed and speechless. Around the store, employees stopped what they were doing, their heads turning in stunned silence. Even a few customers took notice, sensing the tension crackling in the air. "The reckoning begins. Mr. Cole, I didn't know." Elaine stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Jason held up a hand, silencing her. "That's the problem," he said evenly. "You shouldn't need to know who someone is to treat them with respect." Elaine opened her mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. She looked like a woman who had built a house of cards only to watch it crumble. "I'll meet you and the staff in the back office in 10 minutes, Jason continued, his tone leaving no room for argument. "We're going to discuss what just happened here and how we fix it." With that, he turned and walked toward the back of the boutique. Every step echoed in the silent space, each click of his polished shoes a reminder of the storm that had just begun. Elaine stood frozen, clutching the black card in her trembling hands. Around her, the weight of every judgmental glance, every condescending comment, came crashing down. Revelation and realization. The meeting begins. The back office of La Belle Maison was a stark contrast to the boutique's glamorous showroom. Tucked behind a sleek wooden door, it was small and minimalist, with a glass conference table and a wall of framed certificates touting the store's excellence. Elaine sat stiffly at one end of the table, hands wringing in her lap. Her flawless composure had crumbled. The smugness she wore like armor was gone, replaced by a nervous rigidity that seeped into every part of her posture. Around her, the boutique staff, Sophie, 2 senior associates, and a cashier, sat quietly, their expressions uneasy. The sound of the door opening made everyone look up. Jason Cole stepped inside with an air of quiet authority that filled the room. He wasn't angry, not visibly. His calm was far more unsettling. He moved slowly, his eyes surveying the room, settling finally on Elaine. "Let's begin," Jason said, his voice steady but heavy with meaning. He placed his hands on the back of a chair, choosing to stand as he addressed the room. Elaine cleared her throat, forcing herself to speak. "Mr. Cole, Jason raised a hand. "You'll have your chance to explain, Elaine. First, I'd like to ask everyone here a question." The staff exchanged nervous glances as Jason's deep brown eyes swept across them. "How many of you saw what happened out there?" Jason asked, his tone even but pointed. Sophie shifted in her seat. We all did," she admitted quietly. Jason nodded. "And did any of you think it was acceptable?" No one answered. The silence was suffocating. Sophie's cheeks flushed, and one of the senior associates stared at his hands as if they'd suddenly become very interesting. "I didn't think it was right," Sophie finally said, her voice soft but firm. "But I didn't say anything. I'm sorry for that." Jason's gaze softened slightly as he looked at her. "It's hard to speak up, isn't it? Especially when you're afraid of challenging someone in charge." Sophie nodded, unable to meet his eyes. Jason straightened, letting the room settle. "Elaine, would you like to explain what happened today?" Elaine shifted in her chair. "Mr. Cole, I had no idea who you were." Jason's voice cut through like a blade. "That's exactly the problem." Elaine froze, stunned silent. Jason continued, his tone firm but measured. "I want you to think very carefully about what you just said. You're implying that your behavior would have been different if you had known who I was. Do you see how wrong that is?" Elaine's face turned crimson. She opened her mouth but found no defense. "Respect isn't something that should be reserved for people you think matter," Jason said, his words carrying the weight of a lesson learned through years of experience. "Everyone who walks through those doors deserves to be treated with dignity, whether they're a CEO, a janitor, or a little girl who's just out shopping with her father." The weight of truth. The staff sat in stunned silence, the gravity of Jason's words hanging in the air. Elaine's hands trembled slightly as she clenched them in her lap. For the first time in years, she was at a loss. "I built this boutique from nothing," Jason said, his voice steady but filled with quiet pride. "Do you know what this place represents to me, to my family?" No one responded. Jason turned his gaze to Elaine. "This boutique is meant to be a space where people feel welcome, where anyone, no matter what they look like, where they come from, or what they wear, can step inside and feel like they belong. Because luxury doesn't have to mean exclusivity at the cost of respect." Elaine shifted, visibly uncomfortable. "Mr. Cole, I didn't mean to offend you." Jason's expression didn't waver. "It wasn't just me you offended, Elaine. It was my daughter, a 12-year-old girl who did nothing but stand beside her father while he tried to treat her to something nice." Elaine flinched as if the words had struck her. "I wonder," Jason said, leaning slightly forward, "how many other families or individuals have walked out of this store feeling like they didn't belong? How many other little girls or boys have left feeling like they weren't good enough? And how many of them didn't have someone like me to come back and call it out? A glimmer of accountability." The room fell into silence again, but this time there was a shift. Sophie finally lifted her head, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Mr. Cole, I didn't say anything earlier, and I should have. I saw how wrong it was." She looked at Elaine, her voice gaining strength. "You treated that man and his daughter like they were invisible. I was afraid to speak up because I thought I'd lose my job. But now, I wish I had. Jason turned to her, his expression softening. It takes courage to admit that. Sophie, thank you. Elaine glanced sharply at Sophie, but her usual authority was crumbling. She turned back to Jason, her voice quieter, laced with something that might have been remorse. What do you want me to do? Jason let the question hang in the air for a moment before answering. Change, that's what I want. Elaine's brow furrowed, confused. Change. Yes, for you, for this store, and for everyone who works here. Jason crossed his arms, his tone leaving no room for argument. There will be new policies. Everyone will undergo bias and inclusivity training. Every staff member, yourself included, will learn what it means to treat customers as people, not appearances. Elaine paled slightly, but she didn't argue. And you, Jason continued, fixing his gaze on Elaine, will apologize to my daughter personally, not because I'm the owner, but because it's the right thing to do. Elaine swallowed hard, nodding reluctantly. I understand. Jason straightened. Good, because if there's one thing I can't tolerate, it's seeing a child, my child, made to feel like she doesn't belong. The path forward. The meeting ended with a weighty silence. As Jason turned to leave the room, Sophie caught his eye. Mr. Cole. Jason paused. Thank you, she said quietly, her voice sincere. For standing up for her. For standing up for us too. Jason gave her a small nod. It's never too late to do the right thing, Sophie. Remember that. As he stepped out of the office and back into the showroom, Jason spotted Ava waiting just inside the boutique doors. Her small figure looked more at ease now, the tension from earlier replaced with quiet curiosity. Ready, sweetheart? Jason asked, his voice warm. Ava looked up at him, then glanced toward the back office door. Did you fix it? Jason smiled faintly. Not yet, but I made sure they'll try. Ava's smile returned as she slipped her hand into his. Let's go get that hot chocolate, Jason said, guiding her back out into the afternoon sunlight. The meeting in the office. The weight of silence. After Jason and Ava left the boutique, the air felt different, heavier, almost suffocating. Inside the back office, Elaine sat at the glass table with her staff, her composure frayed. She kept her gaze fixed on the surface, where Jason's black card had been left behind like an echo of her mistake. The staff, Sophie, Daniel, and Marta, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. None of them dared speak first. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was the kind that buzzed with guilt and unanswered questions. Sophie cleared her throat, her voice hesitant but firm. So, what happens now? Elaine shot her a sharp look, though it lacked the power it once carried. Her carefully constructed authority was unraveling. Now, she repeated, her voice strained. We do what we've always done. We move on. Daniel, a senior associate who'd worked at the boutique for years, frowned. Move on? Are you serious? Elaine's head snapped toward him. Excuse me. Daniel sat up, his usual quiet demeanor replaced with something stronger. You heard Mr. Cole. Things need to change here. You can't just sweep this under the rug. Elaine's lips thinned. I don't need a lecture, Daniel. I made a mistake. Fine. But do you really think one incident is going to undo everything we've built here? Sophie spoke up again, her voice sharper this time. One incident. Her brown eyes burned with disbelief. It wasn't just an incident, Elaine. You humiliated a father and his daughter because you thought they didn't belong. And if Mr. Cole hadn't come back, you wouldn't even care. That's the problem. The room fell silent again, the accusation hanging heavy in the air. Elaine's fingers twitched against the table, her cheeks flushed. You think you know better than me, Sophie. I've been running this store for 10 years. 10 years. I know what's good for our reputation. Reputation. Daniel cut in, his voice rising slightly. Our reputation isn't worth anything if it comes at the cost of treating people like trash. Elaine froze. She looked at her team, suddenly realizing she was outnumbered, not by force, but by a collective reckoning. The cracks in her armor had become impossible to ignore. Elaine's reflection. Elaine pushed back her chair abruptly, the legs screeching against the floor. She walked to the office window and stared outside, where the street bustled with life. Her reflection stared back at her in the glass, cold, polished, and distant. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't proud of what she saw. What happened to me? She'd started her career in retail at a small boutique, working under a manager who'd been harsh and dismissive, someone she'd promised herself she'd never become. But somewhere along the line, her desire for perfection and exclusivity had hardened her. She'd let her biases fester into something uglier than she cared to admit. Elaine swallowed hard as memories surfaced. Customers she dismissed too quickly, looks she'd given to people who didn't fit her carefully crafted image of what a real shopper should look like. Jason Cole's words echoed in her head. Respect isn't something you reserve for people you think matter. Her throat tightened as she thought of Ava, her small, unsure voice, her lowered gaze. A child shouldn't have to feel unwelcome anywhere. Change is coming. Elaine turned back to the table, her voice quieter now. "You're right," she said softly. Daniel blinked, surprised. "What?" Elaine looked at them, her shoulders less rigid. "You're right. I handled it wrong. All of it." Sophie leaned forward, her tone cautious. "So, what are we going to do?" Elaine let out a shaky breath, as if the admission had cost her. "First, we're going to implement every change Mr. Cole asked for." She glanced at Sophie. "Inclusivity training. Bias training. All of it. I'll make the calls myself." Daniel exchanged a look with Sophie, clearly relieved. "And?" Elaine hesitated, then sat back down. "And I'll apologize to his daughter. I don't know how I'm going to face her, but..." She trailed off, the weight of the admission pulling at her. "It's the least I can do." For the first time that day, Elaine looked like a different person, not the ice-cold manager, but someone who was beginning to realize the depth of her mistake. "I want to fix this," she added quietly. "Not just for Mr. Cole. For this store. For us. A new perspective." By the time Jason and Ava returned home later that evening, Ava's mood had lifted slightly. The cafe's hot chocolate had worked its magic, and she was curled up on the couch with her sketchbook. Jason sat at the dining table, a mug of coffee in his hands. He watched his daughter draw, the soft scratch of her pencil filling the quiet room. "What are you working on?" he asked. Ava looked up, a small smile playing on her lips. "Something for my art showcase." She held up the sketch for him to see. Jason's eyebrows lifted. The drawing was powerful in its simplicity. A girl standing in front of a massive glass boutique, her reflection shining brighter than the building itself. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," Jason said, his voice thick with pride. Ava tilted her head thoughtfully. "Do you think people like her will ever understand?" Jason exhaled slowly, setting his mug down. "Some will, some won't. But the important thing is that you know who you are, and you don't let anyone take that away from you." Ava nodded, her fingers brushing over the page. "I won't." Jason smiled softly, leaning back in his chair. In that moment, he saw something in his daughter that filled him with hope. Resilience. The next morning. The next day, Jason received an email from the boutique. It was short, but it carried weight. Subject: Apology from Elaine Reed. "Mr. Cole, I want to sincerely apologize for my behavior yesterday, both to you and your daughter. I have reflected on my actions, and I realize how deeply wrong I was. I am committed to making meaningful changes to ensure that everyone who walks into this store feels welcome and respected. If Ava is willing, I would like to apologize to her personally as well. Elaine Reed." Jason read the email twice, his expression unreadable. He closed his laptop and looked out the window, where the city stretched before him, vast, busy, and full of possibility. Change didn't happen overnight, but sometimes it only took one moment, one person, to light the spark. And Jason knew that the fire had begun to burn. Ava's perspective and strength. The canvas of emotions. Ava sat at her bedroom desk, her sketchbook sprawled open in front of her. The room was quiet, save for the faint scratching of her pencil against the paper. Her brow furrowed as she worked, her small hand steady despite the storm of thoughts swirling inside her. Yesterday's events still lingered, replaying in her mind like a movie she couldn't turn off. The boutique, the woman with the sharp voice, the way her father had stayed calm even when everything inside her had wanted to cry or scream. She looked down at the page. The sketch had started as a rough idea, but now it was something more. The boutique stood tall and imposing, its glass doors reflecting the world outside. In front of it was a young girl, but this time her figure stood strong, holding a paintbrush like a sword. Ava tilted her head, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips. It was her world, and she could paint it however she wanted. The question she couldn't ask. Ava set her pencil down and leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. The words from the boutique still stung in her chest. "People like you don't belong here." The phrase echoed in her mind, cold and sharp like broken glass. Ava couldn't understand it. Why someone would say something so cruel for no reason at all. She'd asked her father about it last night. He always seemed to have the answers. "Why did she think we didn't belong, Dad?" she had whispered. Jason had paused, his face thoughtful as he looked at her. "Because sometimes people carry around small minds, Ava. They don't see people for who they are. They see only what their prejudice allows them to see." "But that's not fair," she had replied softly. "No," Jason said gently, brushing her braid back. "It's not. But fair or not, you can't let someone else's small mind make you feel small." Now, as she sat in her room, those words echoed louder than the woman's. "You can't let someone else's small mind make you feel small." Ava whispered it to herself as she opened her drawer and pulled out a set of colored pencils. She had a lot of emotions inside her today. Anger, sadness, confusion, but also something stronger. Determination. Her father believed in her, and so she would believe in herself. The art showcase. The day of the art showcase arrived faster than Ava expected. The school's auditorium buzzed with excitement as students set up their easels and arranged their work. Parents wandered through the room, admiring the colorful displays of creativity. Ava stood near her corner of the room, holding her father's hand as they looked at her finished piece. The painting was vibrant and bold, much bolder than anything she'd ever done before. It showed a glass boutique like the one from that day, but instead of being cold and unwelcoming, the glass reflected bright colors of the world, reds, blues, and yellows. In front of it stood a girl who looked just like Ava, holding a paintbrush high above her head, streaks of color bursting out like fireworks. At the bottom, Ava had scrawled a single phrase in careful letters. "We belong where we stand." Jason let out a soft breath, his pride evident as he knelt down beside her. "This is powerful, Ava," he said gently. "You turned something ugly into something beautiful. That takes real courage." Ava beamed, her heart swelling. "It's how I felt, Dad. You said I belong wherever I choose to be, and I wanted to show that." Jason gave her shoulder a squeeze. "And you did. You told the story your way." Facing Elaine. A quiet voice interrupted their moment. "Ava." Ava turned, her smile fading slightly as she looked up to see Elaine standing there. The woman was out of place in the busy, colorful auditorium, her usual polished air softened somehow. She wasn't wearing her sharp heels today, only simple flats, and in her hands, she held a small envelope. Jason stood up, his expression calm but unreadable. Elaine cleared her throat, her voice quieter than Ava had ever heard it. I'm glad I found you," she said, looking at Ava. "I wanted to see your art." Ava glanced at Jason, unsure, but her father gave her a small nod of encouragement. Elaine stepped closer and looked at the painting, her eyes lingering on the bold colors and the words Ava had written at the bottom. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, her shoulders slumped slightly. "It's beautiful," Elaine said softly. "And it says more than I ever could." Ava tilted her head. "Thank you," she replied cautiously. Elaine shifted, holding out the small envelope. "This is for you," she said. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted you to know that I'm trying to be better. I'm learning. And I'm sorry for everything." Ava took the envelope hesitantly and glanced at her father. Jason nodded again, his expression softer now. "Thank you for coming," he said to Elaine, his voice steady. Elaine nodded once before turning and walking away, her steps quieter than before. Ava looked down at the envelope and opened it. Inside was a simple card that read, "I'm sorry. You do belong. Always." Ava smiled faintly, tucking the card into her pocket. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" Jason asked gently. Ava nodded, looking back at her painting. "Yeah, Dad. I think I am." The applause. The art showcase ended with a wave of applause as awards were handed out. Ava didn't win first place, but it didn't matter. As her father hugged her tightly, she felt something more important than a trophy: pride in herself. She had faced something ugly, turned it into something beautiful, and walked out stronger than before. And as they walked home, her hand in her father's, Ava whispered something that made Jason smile. "I know who I am, Dad. I belong wherever I stand." Ava's perspective and strength. Admiring eyes and curious questions. As parents and students wandered through the art showcase, Ava stayed close to her painting, occasionally answering questions about her work. For the first time, she felt something unexpected: pride. Not the small, uncertain pride of completing a project, but the deep kind that comes from turning pain into purpose. A group of students from her class stopped by, whispering among themselves. Ava recognized one of them, Jillian, the girl who always had something to say and was rarely kind about it. Jillian's bright green eyes widened as she studied the bold painting. "Wow," Jillian said, her voice softer than usual. "You did this." Ava nodded, her chin lifted slightly. "Yeah, I did." Jillian tilted her head, still staring at the girl with the paintbrush, the colorful explosion radiating outward. "It's cool. It's like you're showing that nothing can stop you." Ava blinked in surprise. She'd expected teasing or sarcasm, but Jillian sounded impressed, genuine, even. "Yeah," Ava replied, her voice stronger now. "That's exactly what I was trying to say." Another student asked, "What does it mean?" The words at the bottom. Ava smiled faintly, her gaze moving to the phrase she'd written. "We belong where we stand. It means you don't need someone else to tell you where you belong," Ava explained, her voice steady. "You decide that for yourself." The group nodded thoughtfully, their usual chatter subdued. Jillian looked at Ava with a new kind of respect. "You're brave," she said quietly. "I don't think I could do something like this." "You could," Ava replied with a small smile. "Sometimes you just have to try." The teacher's words. Mrs. Garcia, Ava's art teacher, approached the painting next. She was a small, kind woman with silver glasses and a love for nurturing talent in her students. She studied Ava's work for a long moment before turning to her with a proud smile. "This is beautiful, Ava," she said warmly, "and powerful. Art is supposed to make people feel something, and this does exactly that." Ava's cheeks flushed with pride. "Thank you, Mrs. Garcia." Mrs. Garcia crouched down slightly, so they were at eye level. "It's not just the painting, though. It's the story behind it. You took something hurtful and turned it into strength. That's what makes this so special." Jason, standing a few feet away, watched the interaction with quiet pride. He had always known Ava was strong, but seeing her shine in this moment filled him with a pride he couldn't put into words. "Your dad must be so proud of you," Mrs. Garcia added, glancing at Jason. Ava turned toward him, her smile widening. "He is." Jason walked over, placing a hand on her shoulder. "More than proud," he said, his voice full of warmth. "I'm in awe of her." Elaine returns. Toward the end of the showcase, Ava noticed Elaine standing quietly near the entrance to the auditorium. Unlike earlier, when she'd been stiff and formal, now Elaine looked human. Her expression was hesitant, uncertain. She held a small wrapped package in her hands, turning it over nervously as if she didn't quite know what to do with it. Jason noticed her too, and leaned down to whisper to Ava, "Do you want to talk to her?" Ava hesitated, then nodded. "I think so." They walked together toward Elaine, who looked up and stiffened slightly before clearing her throat. "Hello again," she said softly, her voice lacking the sharpness it once carried. Jason stayed quiet, letting Ava take the lead. Elaine crouched down slightly, holding the small package toward Ava. "This is for you," she said, her voice careful and quiet. "It's not much, but I wanted to give you something as an apology. And to thank you." Ava blinked, surprised. "Thank me." Elaine's lips pressed together for a moment before she continued. "Yes, for teaching me something I should have learned a long time ago." She glanced at Jason briefly, then back to Ava. "Your father's right. Respect shouldn't depend on who someone is or what they look like. I'd spent too many years getting that wrong. But your painting, it made me think. You're braver than most adults I know." Ava took the package carefully, her fingers brushing the paper. "Thank you." Elaine stood, her expression softening. "I'm sorry, Ava. I mean that." Ava looked up at her, thoughtful. "It hurt," she said honestly, "but I forgive you." Elaine's eyes glistened slightly, though she quickly blinked the tears away. She turned to Jason. "Thank you, Mr. Cole, for giving me a chance to fix this." Jason nodded, his expression calm. "Make sure you mean it, Elaine. Change starts with actions, not words." "I will," Elaine replied quietly before walking out, her steps far less confident than before. A special gift. Later that evening, when they were home, Ava sat at the dining table with the small package in front of her. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing a delicate leather-bound sketchbook with a note tucked inside. To Ava, "May you always paint the world in colors as bold and bright as your spirit." Elaine. Ava turned to Jason, holding the note in her hands. "Do you think she really meant it, Dad?" Jason looked at her, his voice gentle. "I think she's trying, and sometimes trying is the first step to being better." Ava nodded thoughtfully. She opened the new sketchbook, running her fingers over the blank pages. "I think I'll draw something new," she said, a spark in her eyes. "Something about forgiveness." Jason smiled, brushing her braid back like he always did. "Whatever you draw, sweetheart, it'll be beautiful." Ava picked up her pencil, her small hand steadied as she pressed the tip to the page. The hurt from that day still lingered, but it no longer weighed her down. She had taken that pain and turned it into art, strength, and something no one could take from her, belief in herself. And as she sketched quietly, Jason watched her, knowing that his daughter had just taken her first steps toward becoming not only an artist, but a light in a world that sometimes needed it most. Redemption and renewal. The return to La Belle Maison. 2 weeks after the incident at La Belle Maison, the boutique looked the same from the outside. The glass windows still gleamed, reflecting the busy city street, and the displays inside were as pristine as ever. But something had changed, subtly at first, then profoundly. Jason and Ava walked side by side toward the boutique. Ava was carrying her sketchbook, her small fingers curled protectively around its leather cover, the gift Elaine had given her. Her father had asked her to accompany him that day, though he hadn't said why. "Are we going back to the store, Dad?" Ava asked curiously, glancing up at him. Jason smiled faintly. "We are. There's something I want you to see." Ava tilted her head but followed without hesitation. She trusted him. When they stepped through the glass doors, the boutique still had its polished elegance, but Ava noticed small details that made it feel different. Near the entrance, a new sign stood on a sleek stand. At La Belle Maison, everyone belongs. Respect is luxury. Ava's eyes widened slightly. She tugged her father's sleeve and pointed to the sign. "Did you do that?" Jason chuckled softly. "Not me. But I encouraged it." Elaine stepped forward just then, her expression much softer than before. She was dressed simply, her usual sharpness replaced with an air of humility. "Welcome back, Mr. Cole." "Ava," she said gently. Ava looked up at Elaine, unsure what to say. The woman who had humiliated them now seemed different, as if someone had scraped away layers of hardness to reveal something real underneath. "Hi," Ava said quietly, her voice calm. Elaine knelt to her level, a genuine smile tugging at her lips. "I've been waiting to see you again," she said. "We've made a lot of changes here. You and your dad were right. It's time we treated people the way they deserve." Ava glanced around. She noticed small signs of change. More welcoming displays, employees offering warm greetings to customers of all kinds, and even a new policy board on the back wall titled "Our Values." Elaine reached into her pocket and handed Ava a small envelope, much like the one from before. "I wanted to invite you to something special we're hosting here next week," she said softly. Ava opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a beautifully designed card. "La Belle Maison welcomes young artists. An art exhibit by the next generation." Ava's eyes widened, and she looked up at her father, who smiled knowingly. "We're going to display some of your work right here in the store, Ava," Elaine explained. "You inspired this idea. I wanted to create a space that highlights people, real people, who bring color and light into the world. Like you." Ava blinked in surprise. "Me? My art?" Elaine nodded, her smile warm. "Your art taught me something I needed to learn. I think it will teach others too." Jason placed a gentle hand on Ava's shoulder. "You see, sweetheart, when you stand tall, the world can't help but notice." The boutique transformed. A week later, the boutique looked different, not in its design, but in its energy. The bright white walls had been adorned with colorful paintings from local young artists. Each piece told a story, and Ava's painting, the bold, vibrant glass boutique with the girl holding her paintbrush high, stood proudly in the center of the main display. Above it, in elegant lettering, read the title Ava had chosen. "We belong where we stand." People stopped to admire the work, murmuring their thoughts. Parents brought their children to see the art, pointing out the inspiring message. Customers who had once walked the boutique with noses high now looked around with softer gazes, seeing not just luxury, but humanity. Ava stood by her painting, her heart thudding in her chest as people praised her work. A woman approached her, one who looked polished, wealthy, and elegant. She smiled warmly at Ava. "Did you paint this?" the woman asked. Ava nodded. "I did." The woman tilted her head thoughtfully. "It's beautiful. The message, it's so important. You're very talented." "Thank you," Ava replied, her voice steady and proud. Jason watched from nearby, his pride for Ava growing with every interaction. She had turned something painful into a beacon of hope, and he couldn't have been prouder. Elaine's new path. Elaine stood quietly in the background, watching the art exhibit unfold. She had spent the past 2 weeks overseeing changes in the boutique, not just in policies but in herself. It had been hard, uncomfortable, even, but Jason's words had stuck with her. Change starts with actions, not words. She had started small, learning to listen, addressing her own prejudices, and challenging her assumptions about people. The store's inclusivity training had made her confront the parts of herself she had long ignored. And now, as she watched families walk through the boutique, smiling and admiring the art, she felt a flicker of pride. Elaine caught Jason's gaze from across the room and walked over. "Thank you," she said quietly. I didn't realize how much I needed this. Jason nodded, his expression calm but kind. The hardest part of change is starting it. Elaine smiled faintly. I won't stop here. I promise. The final lesson. When the exhibit ended, Ava stood with her father at the boutique entrance, her hands tucked in her pockets as they watched people leave, chatting happily. Do you see what you've done, sweetheart? Jason asked, crouching beside her. Ava looked up, her eyes bright. What do you mean? You turned something painful into something powerful. You showed people that they can belong wherever they choose to stand. That's not just art. That's strength. Ava smiled, her heart swelling. I just told the truth, Dad. And sometimes telling the truth is the bravest thing of all, Jason replied, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Ava slipped her hand into his as they stepped outside. The boutique's glass doors swung shut behind them. But this time, they didn't feel like a barrier. They felt like an invitation to anyone and everyone who dared to step forward, knowing they belonged. As the sun set, casting golden light across the city, Jason glanced down at Ava. What's next for my artist? Ava grinned, clutching her sketchbook tightly. I think I'll paint something about beginnings. Jason chuckled softly. I can't wait to see it. Together, they walked down the busy sidewalk, their footsteps steady and strong. In that moment, Ava knew she could face anything, because no matter where life took her, she would always stand tall, paintbrush in hand, ready to color the world with her truth. Redemption and renewal. The small ripples that create waves. The following week, Jason sat at his office desk, staring at his inbox. An unexpected flood of emails had poured in over the past few days, all centered around the boutique and Ava's art exhibit. Some messages came from parents who had seen their children's work displayed for the first time. Others came from customers thanking La Belle Maison for its changes, small but meaningful. One email stood out, sent by a woman whose words lingered with him. Subject: Thank you. Dear Mr. Cole, I don't know if you'll see this, but I had to write you. I visited your boutique last weekend for the art exhibit and saw Ava's painting. I brought my 10-year-old daughter with me, and she asked me what "we belong where we stand" meant. I told her it means we don't have to shrink ourselves to fit into someone else's idea of where we should be. That day, she smiled and stood a little taller. For that, I thank you, and Ava. Sincerely, a grateful mother. Jason leaned back in his chair, his chest swelling with quiet pride. He had always believed change could begin with a single moment, a single act, and Ava's bravery, her refusal to be made small, had proven that truth yet again. The next chapter for Elaine. At La Belle Maison, Elaine found herself taking on a new challenge, one that required her to step out of the comfort zone she'd carefully crafted for years. She was working closely with a consultant to implement inclusivity workshops for the staff. On paper, the task seemed simple: revise store policies, train employees, and hold everyone accountable for the boutique's values. But for Elaine, it was more personal. The sessions forced her to reflect not only on her behavior, but on the culture she had fostered in the boutique. It was uncomfortable, looking at the ways her assumptions had hurt others. On her desk sat two things: a printed photo of Ava's painting, the glass boutique bursting with color, and a small plaque engraved with Jason's words. Respect is not a privilege for the few, it is the foundation for all. Elaine stared at the photo often, reminding herself of the little girl she had underestimated, a child whose art had opened her eyes more than any lecture or book ever could. Ava's new opportunity. Back at home, Ava sat cross-legged on the living room floor, surrounded by art supplies. Her fingers smudged with paint, she worked on her latest canvas with quiet focus. This painting was different. It showed a series of doorways, each one opening to reveal something unexpected. A field of wildflowers, a bustling city, an empty beach at sunrise. In the center of the painting stood a small girl holding a paintbrush. But unlike her earlier works, the girl didn't look small at all. She looked confident, as if she were the one opening each door with purpose. Jason walked into the room, a mug of coffee in his hand. He paused, watching Ava in her element. "What are you working on this time, sweetheart?" Ava looked up, a streak of red paint on her cheek. "I'm painting about choices," she said thoughtfully. "How we decide where to go and what to see. Even when some doors look closed, you can open them if you try." Jason smiled, his heart full. "I think that might be your best one yet." Ava grinned. "Maybe I'll paint something for your office next time." Jason chuckled. "I'd be honored to hang it up." As Ava returned to her work, Jason's phone buzzed. It was a message from one of his industry contacts, a curator at a contemporary art gallery downtown. "Jason, I heard about Ava's exhibit at your boutique. Her work has a unique voice, mature and honest. We're hosting a young artist showcase next month, and I'd love to feature her. Let's talk." Jason read the message twice, his smile growing. Ava's message was spreading, just like the ripples of a pebble dropped in a pond. "Looks like we'll need to find another frame for your next piece," he said, setting his phone down. Ava glanced up, puzzled. "Why?" "Because someone else wants to share your work, sweetheart. People are starting to listen to what you have to say." Ava blinked in surprise before her face lit up. "Really? Really?" Jason said, crouching beside her. "Your art doesn't just belong on walls. It belongs in the world, and it's going to make it brighter." Ava's final message. At the boutique, Elaine stood by the main display one evening, admiring Ava's painting for what felt like the 100th time. Customers still stopped to take photos, their eyes lingering on the bold, colorful reflection of the boutique and the girl standing tall in front of it. Ava's handwritten title beneath the painting always struck a chord. "We belong where we stand." The words had become more than just a title. They had become a mantra, quietly repeated by staff members during their training and whispered by parents to their children. Elaine turned as Sophie approached her, a notebook tucked under her arm. "You know," Sophie said softly, "I think this store's better now. It feels different, and I think people notice." Elaine nodded, her gaze returning to Ava's painting. "Change takes time," she replied, "but it starts somewhere." Sophie smiled faintly. "Ava's painting reminds me of that every day." The streets of the city. One afternoon, as Jason and Ava walked past La Belle Maison, Ava stopped and pointed to the glass windows. The boutique was still full of luxury displays, but now something new stood front and center, a poster of Ava's painting. The boutique's statement was written below it. "Luxury is respect. Art is belonging. We all have a place." Ava's heart skipped a beat as she looked up at her father. "They put it in the window." Jason grinned. "They did. That's your voice, Ava. People are listening." Ava smiled as she squeezed her father's hand. In that moment, she realized the lesson her dad had been teaching her all along. Change wasn't just something that happened. Change was something you created. And she had. The final brushstroke. That evening, as the city lights glowed outside her window, Ava sat in her room, adding the final brushstrokes to her painting. This one showed a little girl standing tall on a hilltop, holding a paintbrush that touched the sky. Above her, streaks of vibrant color exploded like fireworks, painting the dark night in shades of hope and strength. At the bottom, Ava wrote, "The world is your canvas. Paint it with courage." Smiling, she stepped back to admire her work. "Ready for the world," she whispered. And she was.